This is GTFM in Wales, one of the beacons of community broadcasting based here in Pontypridd. You can see they've been around for a bit. This is time for a bit of, I don't know, whatever you would need to clean that. It's fantastic to see a radio station that has been around and deeply embedded into the fabric of community life around here. And that's what brings me here. This is a Community Media Champions Award. It's awarded to people who've gone the extra yard, as it were, or is that an extra metre these days, gone above and beyond in helping roll back the frontiers, celebrating the cause, raising awareness of the value to society of community media. Now, Terry, whose award this is, knows he's going to get it, but he hasn't actually seen the award. Let's go meet him now and see what he has to say. I believe he's in here in Studio 2. And here he is.
Dom, hi.
Here we
go. What a surprise.
Absolutely. This is the Community Media Champions Award for you, Terry Mann, for the work that you've done here and the support that you've offered, the general kind of mission of community broadcasting and non-profit media in the UK, but specifically around GTFM. So with the congratulations of the CMA, there you go.
Well, thank you very much. You know, this is my first gong in 50 years in broadcasting.
50 years?
50 years. Well, more than that, actually. So that's rather nice. That will go on my mantelpiece.
Excellent.
So absolutely fantastic. Well, thank you very much. Well, I mean, it's a team effort, this, mind. I'm not sure I should be singled out in this way.
Well, I think the singling out is well merited because people nominate for this and names come forward and yours was one of those names. But you're absolutely right. Of course, you're representing the wider efforts of the team, the volunteer goodwill. So whilst we're on it, I mean, tell us about GTFM. Where did it come from?
Well, it came from an experiment back in the Access Radio times. So it's actually older than the regulator, Ofcom. It was one of the 15 stations that was licensed by the Radio Authority when they were shutting up shop and moving across the road and becoming Ofcom, the following year or whatever. And they set it going because there'd been a lobby for community radio, well, I can remember since the mid-70s. And the excuse had been there are no frequencies. And eventually the engineers found that actually there are plenty of frequencies, but the BBC owns most of them. And then they found a new way of allocating frequencies. And a lot of the community stations of today are co-channeled with BBC stations. And the technicians said for 30 years that wasn't possible. And of course it is.
So were you involved in the lobbying for community radio, the right for an area to have an FM community broadcaster?
Personally, no. I'd been involved, I started off with the BBC in Radio Bristol because that was my local station when I left school and there was no commercial radio. I jumped ship to commercial radio when it started because it actually had medium wave, which is where the listeners were, and lots of promise because it was local radio. And I wanted to do local radio with listeners. Not that Bristol didn't have listeners, because it's actually a really good station. And I'm hugely grateful for the BBC background, in working there. But I was asked by my line manager, a guy called Colin Mason, if I'd come with him, because I knew about pop music and he didn't, perhaps. And he wanted me to programme the music on this new station called Swansea Sound that he ended up being programme controller of. So I went with him to that. We launched Swansea Sound. Rest is history, because it was enormously successful. 63% reach it had in its first Jikra, which was, the precursor of Rajar. So I was in local commercial radio right the way through until it stopped being local, I think. And I came across this station by chance, which had been set up, ironically, in the sound of Swansea Sound by Andrew Jones, who's a local chap in a housing association who'd always been a radio enthusiast and was brought up in Brecon and given a transistor radio for his Christmas present, I think, when he was about 10. And on it was Swansea Sound in its very early days, sounding like a proper local radio station. He just loved that sound. And when he had the opportunity to introduce a local RSL station in the immediate vicinity where this radio station is now, more of a social cohesion exercise than anything else, because there were lots of issues on the estate and they did this 1 month broadcast.
Which is what an RSL is.
Which is what an RSL is,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, a good point. And under the name GTFM, which then meant Glintaff, there was a Glintaff Residents Association, and they were part of the management of it in the very early days. So GTFM was sort of Glintaff Radio, because that's the immediate micro, community around here.
Well, it sets right at the start, doesn't it? The link between the community and the radio station.
Yes, I mean, the whole purpose of it was social cohesion and a very positive, sending out a positive message, getting people involved in community activity. And there were lots of issues with the housing stock, problems with heating supplies and all sorts of things. And the idea, and, Andrew's idea, when they said, well, look, we need to get the community together here, get some community spirit going. He said, I know, let's have a radio station. And they all went, yeah, how do you do that? Well, of course, he'd swatted up and found out from the IBA or Radio Authority, whoever's in charge, how you did that. And the rest is history, because when the Radio Authority advertised for interested stations to come forward to take part in the experiment, then there was already a radio station, albeit an RSL. He'd done 2 RSLs then, on which to base, a full-time GTFM experiment. And Andrew did this in conjunction with the local university, who had a campus with studios, and they used to do RSLs for their students as well. I think they were called Fusion Radio at the time. So they did the evening programmes, and the daytime programmes came from a studio here in Reedvellen. And that's how GTFM started, as a full-time station.
And you got involved sort of by accident, didn't you?
Well, Andrew produced a documentary about Swansea Sound's launch. I was there. I produced the first programme, on the very first programme on Swansea Sound in 1974. So I kind of knew about that. And he did a really good job. Now, I'd heard this coming out of Swansea Sound, this programme. But also I was working freelance as sort of advisor to stations. Anyway, I made myself known to Andrew, and he said, actually, do you know about transmitters? And I'd just done the planning for Real Radio for all of their FM transmitters west of Swansea, because they'd been given permission to go west. And I'd worked all of that through with them. So he said, here's the good news. Ofcom have come into being. They've said we're great, we're doing a great job, and we can have a full-time rollover license, like roll straight from the experiment, because we're talking 2005 now. The thing's been running as an experiment successfully for 3 years. And Ofcom said, well, you can continue, but the bad news is we need the frequency back to give to a regional radio station. So you'll have to change your frequency, or you'll have to move your transmitter as well, because it's louder in Caerphilly than it is in Ponty, and Ponty is actually the target place. He said, do you know anything about any of that? And I said, funny enough, yes. So I came in as a consultant to do the transmitter move. I also looked after programmes a bit while Andrew was setting up some RSL stations, which have since become things like Ron the Radio. It's like an offshoot.
Just up the road.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that was meant to be a GTFM satellite station, but there was a little bit of a falling out, and it became sort of more separate than that, although it's back in the fold to some degree now. We provide news for it, for example. So I was involved with the station, and I got a call from the chairman one morning who said, Terry, you've run radio stations, haven't you? And I said, yeah, a few, because I'd set up the Wave in Swansea and other stuff. He said, well, Andrew has left us, and we just need someone to look after it for a little while we find a new manager. I think that was about 2007. And what is it now?
And here we are. Listen, let's just, if someone was walking into this area, tuning in for the first time, in a few short sentences, how would you describe GTFM's place in the community hereabouts?
Well, we'd like to think we're pivotal. We're not pivotal in the same way as a hospital, or a frontline provider of essential things, I suppose. But what we are is a good old-fashioned local radio station, which does its best to be a community hub and pass on information. And the thing is, tens of thousands of people listen to it. The last time we could afford a survey, we were market leader by miles and miles and miles. which surprises people. But then we're a good old-fashioned local radio format. We're hits from the 60s to now.
So you know your audience.
We're very accessible.
Yeah.
We haven't changed the plot because the plot always worked. And the station was modelled, remember, on early days Swansea Sound, which was enormously successful. All we've done musically is add the decades in between.
And there's an element about skilling up people in the community, isn't there?
Well, Andrew always believed, and I 100% reflect that, and my deputy Gavin and everyone works here as well, that to be a successful voice in the community, you need first to be sounding as professional as possible. Now, there are people in community radio who disagree vehemently with that and say we shouldn't be slick, like commercial and all of that. But Andrew's point, and mine entirely, is that to get to the threshold of being a trusted member of the community, you've got to actually sound like a radio station that knows what the hell it's doing. And we do, but we sound quite like old days ILR before it lost its localness. And some people find that uncomfortable in community radio.
But I'm not one of them. And I do think that community radio, at the end of the day, these are not terms that the public generally use. They may talk about their local radio station. They may have that loyalty for local radio. If you're operating under the community model, and you've replaced what was the old independent local radio stations that you're talking about were set up in the 70s and then grew in the next few decades. They've retreated back to regional and national offers. So community radio as a business model has replaced that. And as I said on my introduction, GTFM, I would say, is a shining beacon of great practice and good practice in that. And so I'm gonna bring our conversation, which I have a feeling could go on until the cows come home. I'm going to bring it to an end now by saying, on behalf of the CMA, many congratulations with your award. You and this station and everybody on this great team I've met, here's my second visit here, are doing a fantastic job. Keep doing it.
Thank you.